There's nothing quite like watching your family lose faith in you. Noah Briggs felt that sting every time his ex-wife shook her head or his sister rolled her eyes at his latest, brilliant plan. Standing on the deck of a rotting yacht called the Serafina, Noah looked like a man who'd hit rock bottom. 3 months earlier, he'd lost his job as a marine salvage coordinator. Now he was living on a boat that leaked more than it floated, inherited from a godfather he barely remembered. His family called it Uncle Marcus's floating coffin. The marina owner suggested he haul it to the scrapyard. His ex-wife had been even blunter when dropping off their son. "You're going to sink with that thing, Noah." But Noah had learned something during his Coast Guard years. Sometimes the most battered things hold the biggest surprises. The Serafina looked worthless, but she was about to reveal a wartime secret that would turn everything upside down. What happens when the treasure you find isn't the one you were looking for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pelican Bay Marina, painting the weathered docks in golden hues that almost made the place look respectable. Almost. Noah Briggs stepped carefully around a rotted plank as he carried his coffee mug toward the Serafina, nodding to old Pete, who was already tinkering with his pristine fishing boat 2 slips down. "Morning, Noah," Pete called out, his voice carrying the particular mix of sympathy and curiosity that had become familiar over the past 3 months. "Sleep any better last night?" "Like a baby," Noah lied, not mentioning the bucket he'd emptied twice during the night or the way the hull creaked with every small wave. Pete meant well, but Noah had grown tired of being the marina's charity case. The Serafina sat low in the water, her once white fiberglass hull now stained with rust streaks and green algae. 42 feet of what had probably been somebody's dream boat 30 years ago, she now looked like she was one storm away from becoming a reef. The cabin windows were cloudy with salt residue, and the canvas awning over the cockpit had more holes than fabric. But she was home now, and Noah had learned to find dignity in small victories. He'd managed to get the diesel engine running 3 days ago. The refrigerator worked intermittently. The shower produced lukewarm water for exactly 4 minutes before running cold. It wasn't much, but it was his, and more importantly, it was free. The inheritance had come as a complete surprise. Noah barely remembered Uncle Marcus's father's older brother, who disappeared into some kind of government work when Noah was a kid. Family legend said Marcus had been in the Navy during World War II, then worked for various federal agencies afterward. He'd send Christmas cards with foreign postmarks and occasionally show up at family reunions with interesting stories and expensive gifts, but he'd remained largely a mystery. When the lawyer's letter arrived 6 months ago, Noah had assumed it was some kind of mistake. Marcus Briggs had died at 89 in a veterans care facility in San Diego, leaving his entire estate to my godson Noah, who I trust will understand the value of things that don't appear valuable at first glance. The estate consisted of the yacht, a small storage unit containing mostly nautical equipment, and exactly 8,247 in a checking account, barely enough to cover the marina fees and basic maintenance. Noah's sister Carol had laughed when she'd heard. "Leave it to Marcus to stick you with a floating money pit," she'd said. "You should sell it for scrap and take whatever you can get." But Noah couldn't bring himself to do it. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the fact that he literally had nowhere else to go. The apartment lease had ended when he'd lost his job at Pacific Marine Salvage. His savings had evaporated during 3 months of unemployment. The divorce settlement had left him with monthly support payments that ate up most of any income he might find. Living on the yacht had started as a temporary solution. Now, watching his 12-year-old son Jake climb carefully down the ladder into the main cabin, Noah wondered if it might become permanent. "Dad, the coffee maker's making that weird noise again," Jake called out from below. His voice carried the patient tone of a kid who'd learned to adapt to his father's increasingly unconventional lifestyle choices. "I'll look at it later," Noah replied, following him down into the cramped living space that had become their weekend sanctuary. The main cabin was actually larger than he'd expected, a small galley kitchen, a dining area that converted to a second sleeping space, and a forward cabin where Jake slept during his court-mandated weekend visits. Jake was already spreading his homework across the dinette table, his math textbook competing for space with nautical charts Noah had been studying. At 12, Jake had his mother's practical nature and his father's curiosity about how things worked. He'd adapted to the yacht's quirks with remarkable grace, treating each weekend visit like a camping adventure rather than evidence of his father's declining circumstances. "Mom wants to know if you're going to get a real apartment soon," Jake said without looking up from his algebra problems. The question was delivered with careful neutrality, but Noah caught the underlying concern. "This is real enough for now," Noah said, settling into the opposite bench seat. "What's she worried about?" Jake shrugged, still focused on his homework. "She thinks you're having some kind of midlife crisis. Living on a boat, talking about fixing it up instead of looking for a real job." He paused, then looked up with eyes that seemed older than 12. "Are you okay, Dad? I mean, really okay?" The question hit harder than Noah expected. How do you explain to your kid that you're not just okay, but that you're trying to figure out what okay even means anymore? At 48, Noah had thought he had life figured out. 20 years of steady work in marine salvage, a house in the suburbs, a marriage that seemed solid if not passionate. Then it had all unraveled in the space of 6 months, the company downsizing, the realization that his marriage had been coasting on autopilot for years, the humbling discovery that his skills were considered outdated in an industry increasingly dominated by younger, cheaper contractors. "I'm working on okay," Noah said finally. "Sometimes life throws you a curveball, and you have to figure out how to hit it. This boat, Uncle Marcus leaving it to me, maybe it's an opportunity I haven't figured out yet." Jake nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Like when you used to dive for the Coast Guard. Mom showed me some pictures. You looked really cool in all that gear." Noah smiled at the memory. His Coast Guard diving days felt like another lifetime, 15 years of rescue operations, evidence recovery, and underwater salvage work that had taken him from the icy waters off Alaska to the warm currents of the Caribbean. He'd been good at it, respected for his technical skills, and calm under pressure. Those had been the years when he'd felt most like himself, when his work had clear purpose and measurable results. "That was a long time ago," Noah said. "Different kind of diving than what I ended up doing commercially. But you still remember how to do it, right? All the technical stuff?" "Like riding a bicycle," Noah assured him. "Some things you don't forget." Jake returned to his homework, but Noah could see his mind working on something beyond algebra. The kid had always been observant, picking up on details that adults missed. It was one of the things that worried his ex-wife Jake's tendency to notice when the grown-ups were struggling, his instinct to try to fix things that weren't his responsibility to fix. The afternoon passed quietly, with Jake finishing his schoolwork, while Noah tackled a small repair project in the engine compartment. The Serafina's diesel engine was older than Jake, but it was built to last, and Noah found satisfaction in the methodical process of maintenance and repair. Working with his hands had always helped him think, and there was something therapeutic about problems that had clear solutions. As evening approached, they prepared dinner together in the compact galley-grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, nothing fancy but warm and filling. Jake had become surprisingly adept at cooking in the tiny space, adapting recipes to work with limited counter space and a 2-burner stove. "Dad," Jake said as they cleaned up, "what was Uncle Marcus really like? I mean, besides the Christmas cards and stuff." Noah paused in his dishwashing, considering the question. "Honestly, I'm not sure I ever really knew him. He was always kind of mysterious. Your grandfather used to say Marcus lived in a different world than the rest of us." "What kind of different world?" "The kind where you work for the government doing things you can't talk about at family dinners," Noah said. He'd show up with stories about places he'd been, but never much detail about what he'd actually been doing there. I always got the impression he'd seen things, done things, that most people don't. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's why he left you the boat. Maybe he thought you'd understand it better than other people would. The observation was more perceptive than Noah expected. Maybe so. Though I have to admit, I'm still trying to figure out what there is to understand about a 40-year-old yacht that needs more work than I can afford. But you're not giving up on it, Jake observed, even though everyone thinks you should. No, Noah agreed. I'm not giving up on it. They spent the evening on deck, watching the sun set over the bay, while other boat owners finished their own end-of-day routines. The marina had a small community feel people who looked out for each other, shared tools and advice, and respected each other's need for privacy. Noah had been surprised by how readily he'd been accepted, even living aboard what was clearly the marina's least impressive vessel. Sam Rodriguez, the marina manager, stopped by just as the first stars appeared. Sam was somewhere in his 60s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life around boats and the casual authority of a man who knew his business inside and out. Evening, Noah. Jake. Sam settled onto the dock, piling next to the Serafina's stern, moving with the careful economy of motion that came with age and experience. How's she treating you? Can't complain, Noah said. Well, I could, but it wouldn't do much good. Sam chuckled. Marcus always said this boat had good bones, said she was built for more than weekend pleasure cruising, though he never explained what he meant by that. You knew Uncle Marcus well? Well enough. He kept the boat here for, 15 years or so. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but he knew his way around boats. Always seemed to be working on something, upgrading this or reinforcing that. Most owners, they make cosmetic improvements, new cushions, fancy electronics. Marcus was always working on structural stuff, things you wouldn't notice unless you knew what to look for. Jake leaned forward with interest. What kind of structural stuff? Sam glanced at Noah, as if checking whether this was appropriate conversation for a 12-year-old. Reinforcement work, mostly. Bulkheads, hull bracing, that sort of thing. Like he was planning to take her places where she might need to be especially strong. Did he ever take her out much? Noah asked. Now and then. Never for long trips, at least not that I saw, but he'd take her out for sea trials whenever he finished a project. Always came back satisfied, like the boat had passed some kind of test. Sam paused, looking thoughtful. You know, he asked about you a few times over the years. Wanted to know how you were doing, what kind of work you were in. I got the impression he was keeping track of your career, your family situation. This was news to Noah. He never contacted me directly. Marcus wasn't much for direct contact with family, but he cared about people. He left you this boat for a reason, Noah. Might be worth figuring out what that reason was. After Sam left, Noah and Jake sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle sound of water lapping against the hull. The marina's evening rhythm was peaceful, the soft murmur of conversations from other boats, the distant sound of traffic from the highway, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the bay. Dad, Jake said eventually, I like it here. I mean, I know it's not what Mom thinks I should like, but I like the way it feels. Like we're on an adventure or something. Noah felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. I like it too, kiddo. Maybe we're both a little crazy. Maybe, Jake agreed cheerfully, but it's a good kind of crazy. As they prepared for bed, Noah reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a suburban father with a predictable routine and a clear sense of his place in the world. Now he was living on a boat with uncertain prospects and a growing sense that Uncle Marcus's final gift might be more complex than it appeared. He tucked Jake into the forward cabin, checking that the small porthole fan was working to keep air circulating in the compact space. Jake had adapted to sleeping aboard with remarkable ease, treating the gentle motion of the boat as a comfort rather than a disturbance. Good night, Dad, Jake said sleepily. Tomorrow can we look at more of the boat? I mean, really look at it. There's so much stuff I haven't figured out yet. Sure thing, Noah promised. We'll give her a thorough inspection. As Noah settled into his own berth in the main cabin, he found himself thinking about Sam's words. Marcus had been keeping track of him, had left him the boat for a reason. Maybe it was time to stop seeing the Serafina as a burden and start treating her as the puzzle she seemed to be. Outside, the marina settled into its nighttime quiet, the gentle sounds of water and wind creating a lullaby that was becoming familiar. For the first time in months, Noah felt something that might have been optimism. Tomorrow, he and Jake would explore their floating home more thoroughly, and maybe they'd begin to understand what Uncle Marcus had really left them. Saturday morning brought one of those perfect coastal days that made Noah remember why he'd loved living near the water. Jake arrived early, dropped off by his mother with her usual mixture of concern and barely concealed disapproval. She'd given the Serafina her weekly inspection, checking the life jackets, testing the radio, making sure the fire extinguisher was properly mounted before reluctantly agreeing to leave Jake for the weekend. "Remember, you promised to have him call me tonight," Linda had said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected disappointment. "And Noah, please try to do something normal this weekend, maybe take him to a movie or the mall." Normal. As if living on a boat was somehow abnormal, as if trying to make the best of an inherited gift was a character flaw. Noah had simply nodded and assured her that Jake would be fine, that they'd have a good weekend together. Now, watching Jake eagerly pull on work gloves that were 3 sizes too big for his hands, Noah felt a surge of gratitude for his son's enthusiasm. Whatever reservations Linda had about their floating home, Jake seemed to genuinely enjoy their weekend projects. "So, what's the plan today, Dad?" Jake asked, already heading toward the toolbox Noah kept in the cockpit locker. "Are we going to work on the engine again, or maybe try to fix that leak in the head?" "Actually, I thought we'd do something different today," Noah said, pulling out a clipboard where he'd sketched a rough diagram of the boat's layout. "I want to do a complete inspection of the hull, check every compartment, every storage area, see exactly what we're working with." Jake's eyes lit up with the prospect of exploration. "Like a treasure hunt?" "More like a survey," Noah said, though he couldn't help smiling at his son's excitement. "When I was doing salvage work, the first rule was always to know your vessel completely before you started any major project. We've been living here for 3 months, but I realize we've never really examined her systematically." They started in the engine compartment, a cramped space beneath the cockpit that housed the diesel engine, fuel tanks, and various mechanical systems. Noah had spent plenty of time here during the past few months, but today he looked at it with fresh eyes, noting details he'd previously overlooked. "Dad, look at this," Jake said, running his hand along what appeared to be an extra bulkhead behind the engine. "This wall seems thicker than it needs to be, and see these bolt patterns? They don't match the others." Noah squeezed into the tight space beside his son, following Jake's pointing finger. The boy was right. The rear bulkhead was indeed unusual, constructed with heavier materials and secured with marine-grade bolts that looked newer than the surrounding structure. "Interesting," Noah murmured, tapping the surface with his knuckles. Instead of the hollow sound he expected, he heard something closer to a dull thud. "Sounds like there might be something behind here." "A secret compartment?" Jake asked, his voice rising with excitement. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Noah said, though he felt his own curiosity stirring. "Could be extra insulation, or maybe a redundant fuel tank. But you're right, it's worth investigating." They spent the next hour carefully examining the bulkhead, looking for access panels or removable sections. Jake proved to have an excellent eye for detail, pointing out irregularities in the construction that Noah might have missed. Finally, in the lower corner near the bilge, Jake discovered what appeared to be a maintenance panel secured with marine screws that showed signs of having been removed and replaced multiple times. "Dad, these screws are definitely newer than the rest," Jake said, running his finger around the panel's edge. "And look, there are tool marks here, like someone's been working on this recently." Noah retrieved his cordless drill and carefully removed the screws. The panel came away easily, revealing a dark space behind the bulkhead that was definitely not part of the original construction. Using his flashlight, Noah peered into the cavity and felt his breath catch. "What do you see?" Jake asked, trying to peer over his father's shoulder. "I'm not sure yet," Noah said, reaching carefully into the space. His fingers encountered something wrapped in what felt like oiled canvas. Gently, he extracted a rectangular package about the size of a large book. They carried their discovery up to the main cabin, where they could examine it in better light. The package was wrapped in heavy canvas and secured with waxed cord that had obviously been tied by someone who knew their knots. Jake watched with intense concentration as Noah carefully untied the bindings. Inside the canvas was a wooden box, beautifully crafted from what looked like teak, with brass corners and a small brass nameplate that read, "Briggs, Personal." The box wasn't locked, but it opened with the careful precision of something built to last. The contents took Noah's breath away. On top was a letter addressed to him in Uncle Marcus's careful handwriting. Beneath that were nautical charts, not modern ones, but what appeared to be wartime navigation charts with hand-drawn annotations and markings. At the bottom of the box were several photographs, black and white images that showed a much younger Marcus in what looked like military gear, standing beside various boats and ships. Noah opened the letter with trembling fingers. "My dear Noah," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you've begun to explore the Serafina properly, and she started to reveal her secrets to you. I always hoped it would be you who inherited her, though I wasn't certain until recent years that you had the character and skills necessary for what I'm about to ask of you. The Serafina is not what she appears to be. During the war, and for some years after, she served a purpose that I was never able to discuss with the family. There are things hidden aboard her that have been waiting for the right person to discover them, things that matter more than their monetary value, though that value is considerable. You were a Coast Guard diver, Noah. You understand the importance of careful preparation, methodical investigation, and above all, discretion. These qualities will serve you well in the coming weeks. Trust your instincts, trust your son. I suspect young Jake has inherited the family eye for detail, and above all, trust that I would never have burdened you with something you couldn't handle. The charts in this box will help you understand what you're looking for. The photographs will help you understand why it matters. And the boat herself will reveal her secrets as she decides you're ready for them. Be careful, Noah. What you're about to discover has been hidden for good reasons. There are still people who would go to great lengths to possess it. But I believe you have the integrity to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. Your loving godfather, Marcus. Jake had been reading over Noah's shoulder, and now he looked up with eyes wide with excitement and maybe a little fear. "Dad, what kind of secrets? What was Uncle Marcus doing during the war?" Noah studied the photographs more carefully. They showed Marcus with various groups of men, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes. The boats in the background ranged from small fishing vessels to larger military craft. In one photograph, Marcus stood beside what was unmistakably a younger version of the Serafina, though she looked quite different, more utilitarian, with modifications that suggested she'd been built for serious work rather than pleasure cruising. "I'm not sure yet," Noah said honestly, "but I think Uncle Marcus was involved in something important, something that required boats and people who could keep secrets." The nautical charts were even more intriguing. They covered various sections of the Pacific coast, but they were marked with symbols and notations that weren't standard navigational aids. Some markings appeared to indicate specific coordinates, while others seemed to mark routes or areas of special interest. "Look at this one," Jake said, pointing to a chart that covered the waters around Pelican Bay. "There are marks all around this area, and look, there's a mark right where our marina is." Noah studied the chart more carefully. Jake was right, there were multiple markings in the local waters, including what appeared to be a detailed notation about depth soundings and bottom conditions near their current location. "Dad," Jake said quietly, "I think Uncle Marcus chose this marina on purpose. I think the Serafina was supposed to be here." The implications were beginning to sink in. Marcus hadn't simply left Noah abothed, left him a puzzle, a mystery that spanned decades and apparently involved secrets important enough to hide for 70 years. Noah's phone buzzed with a text message from his sister Carol. Mom wants to know if you're still playing boat captain or if you've come to your senses yet. Family dinner Sunday if you want to join the normal people. Normal people. Noah looked at Jake, who was carefully studying one of the photographs through a magnifying glass he'd found in the navigation drawer. "Dad," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder, "I don't think we're normal people anymore." Noah had to agree. Whatever Uncle Marcus had left them, it was definitely not normal. And for the first time since inheriting the Serafina, Noah found himself genuinely excited about what they might discover next. "So what do we do now?" Jake asked. Noah looked at the charts, the photographs, and his son's eager face. 3 months ago, he'd been a failed businessman living on a leaky boat. Now he was apparently the guardian of some kind of historical secret that his mysterious godfather had protected for decades. "Now," Noah said, "we figure out what Uncle Marcus really wanted us to find." Sunday morning found Noah in the marina's small office, hunched over Sam Rodriguez's computer, while Jake spread the nautical charts across the coffee table. Sam had offered to help with research after Noah had cautiously mentioned finding some of Marcus's old papers, though Noah had been careful not to reveal the full extent of their discovery. "Your uncle was before my time in terms of the war stuff," Sam said, settling into his desk chair with a cup of coffee. "But I knew him for 15 years, and I can tell you he wasn't your typical retiree. Man had more books about naval history than most libraries." Noah typed Marcus Briggs World War II into the search engine, then added Pacific Theater and Naval Operations. The results were frustratingly generic, thousands of entries about the war, but nothing specifically about his godfather. "Try adding covert operations or intelligence," Jake suggested from his position on the floor, where he was using a magnifying glass to examine the hand-drawn symbols on the charts. The addition of those terms yielded more interesting results. Several academic papers referenced classified operations involving small boat infiltration and supply runs to resistance groups throughout the Pacific. One paper, published by the Naval War College, mentioned a program called Operation Seahorse that had used civilian vessels for intelligence gathering and supply operations. "Dad, look at this," Jake said, holding up one of the charts. "This symbol here, it looks like a seahorse." Noah looked where Jake was pointing. Among the various markings was indeed a small, stylized seahorse symbol, repeated at several locations along the coast. Cross-referencing with the academic paper, Noah felt a chill of recognition. "Sam," Noah said carefully, "did Marcus ever mention anything about wartime operations? Anything about using boats for special missions?" Sam leaned back in his chair, studying Noah's face. "He mentioned a few things over the years. Nothing detailed, you understand, but enough to know he'd been involved in some serious business. Said the war had taught him that sometimes the most important work was the kind that never made it into the history books." "What kind of work?" "Near as I could figure, he was involved in getting people and supplies to places where regular military couldn't go. Small boats, night operations, that sort of thing. He had skills navigation, small boat handling, languages. During the war, those skills were valuable for certain kinds of missions." Jake looked up from the charts with excitement. "Dad, what if Uncle Marcus was like a secret agent or something?" "Not exactly a secret agent," Sam said with a smile. "More like a specialized courier. There were civilian contractors who worked with military intelligence, people who could blend in, operate independently. Marcus had the right background for that kind of work." Noah found another relevant article, this one from a maritime history journal. It described how the Navy had recruited experienced civilian mariners for covert operations throughout the Pacific, using their knowledge of local waters and their ability to operate without military oversight. "The interesting thing," Sam continued, "was that Marcus never really stopped that kind of work after the war. He'd disappear for weeks at a time, come back with stamps from places that weren't exactly tourist destinations. Always said he was doing consulting work for the government, but I got the impression it was more specialized than that." "How specialized?" Noah asked. "Well, put it this way, Marcus knew things about navigation, underwater operations, and secure storage that you don't learn from weekend sailing courses. And he spent a lot of time over the years upgrading the Serafina in ways that didn't make sense for recreational boating. Jake had moved to a different chart, one that showed the waters around the Channel Islands. "Dad, look at this one. There are depth markings here that aren't on regular charts, and more of those seahorse symbols." Noah studied the chart Jake indicated. The markings were incredibly detailed, showing underwater topography and what appeared to be specific anchor points or hiding spots. Someone had invested considerable time and effort in mapping these waters for purposes that went far beyond normal navigation. "Sam, did Marcus ever take the Serafina out to the Channel Islands?" "Oh, regularly. Said he liked the fishing out there, but he never came back with much fish. Always seemed more interested in the water conditions, the currents, that sort of thing." Sam paused, looking thoughtful. "You know, now that I think about it, he always went alone on those trips, never invited anyone along, never talked much about what he did out there." Noah's phone rang, Linda calling to check on Jake. He stepped outside to take the call, leaving Jake to continue his chart examination under Sam's watchful eye. "How's the weekend going?" Linda asked, her tone neutral, but alert for any signs of trouble. "Good. Jake's helping me with some research about the boat's history. We found some interesting materials that Uncle Marcus left behind." "What kind of materials?" Noah hesitated. "How do you explain to your ex-wife that you've discovered evidence your godfather was involved in covert operations and has left you some kind of treasure hunt?" "Nautical charts, some photographs, historical stuff about the boat's previous use." "Noah, please tell me you're not getting obsessed with some kind of boat restoration project that's going to consume all your time and money." "I'm being careful, Linda, but this is actually interesting stuff. Educational for Jake." "Educational? How?" "History, geography, problem solving. He's really engaged with the research process." There was a long pause. "Just promise me you'll keep things in perspective, okay? Jake needs stability, not another one of your projects that starts with great enthusiasm and ends with disappointment." The comment stung because it contained more truth than Noah cared to admit. His track record with ambitious projects wasn't stellar, but this felt different. This had purpose beyond his own interests. "I promise," Noah said. "Jake's welfare comes first." When he returned to the office, Jake was showing Sam something on one of the photographs. Both of them looked up with expressions of excitement. "Dad, Sam recognizes this place," Jake said, pointing to a photograph that showed Marcus standing beside a small dock with mountains in the background. "It's Catalina Island, but not the main harbor." "That's Isthmus Cove," Sam confirmed. "Small anchorage on the north side of the island. Not much there, except a few buildings and a pier. But Marcus used to mention that place, specifically said it had good holding ground and reliable wind patterns." Noah studied the photograph more carefully. In the background, he could see what appeared to be other boats, and several people who weren't in military uniform but carried themselves with military bearing. "When was this taken, do you think?" "Based on the boats in the background, I'd say late 1940s, maybe early 1950s, Sam said. "Post-war, but not by much." Jake had pulled out another chart, this one showing Catalina Island in detail. Sure enough, there were markings at Isthmus Cove depth soundings, what appeared to be compass bearings, and several of the seahorse symbols. "Dad, what if Uncle Marcus hid something out there? What if that's what all these charts are showing us?" The possibility was intriguing, but Noah felt a responsibility to temper Jake's enthusiasm with realism. "Even if that's true, kiddo, we're talking about something that happened 70 years ago. Whatever might have been hidden could be long gone by now." "But what if it's not?" Jake insisted. "What if Uncle Marcus left these charts because he wanted us to find whatever he hid?" Sam leaned forward with interest. "You know, Marcus did maintain that boat of his pretty carefully over the years. And he was always upgrading her navigation equipment, adding GPS systems that could mark precise coordinates. For a man who mostly just putted around the local waters, he sure was interested in accurate positioning." Noah felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that had once made him a good salvage diver. The systematic approach to a mystery the careful analysis of evidence, the gradual construction of a theory based on available facts. It had been years since he'd felt that particular intellectual excitement. "Okay," Noah said finally, "let's assume for the moment that Uncle Marcus did hide something, and that these charts are meant to help us find it. What would be the logical first step?" "Survey the Serafina more thoroughly," Jake said immediately. "If he hid charts and photographs, there might be other stuff. Better equipment, maybe more detailed instructions." "That's good thinking," Noah agreed. "What else?" "Research the historical context," Sam suggested. "Find out more about Operation Seahorse and whatever other covert programs Marcus might have been involved in. Understanding the mission might help you understand what he was protecting." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "And we should plan a trip to Catalina Island. Even if we don't find anything, we could at least see the places marked on the charts." Noah looked at his son's eager face and felt a mixture of pride and concern. Jake was approaching this like a genuine research project, showing analytical skills that impressed Noah. But he was also 12 years old, and the last thing Noah wanted was to encourage unrealistic expectations. "Those are all good ideas," Noah said, "but we need to be systematic about this, and we need to be realistic about what we might or might not find." "But we're going to try, right?" Jake asked. "We're not just going to put everything back in the box and pretend we never found it." Noah looked at the charts, the photographs, and his son's hopeful expression. 3 months ago, his biggest concern had been making the boat's engine run reliably. Now he was contemplating some kind of treasure hunt based on 70-year-old clues left by a godfather he'd barely known. It was either the most foolish thing he'd ever considered or the most interesting opportunity he'd had in years. "Yeah," Noah said finally, "we're going to try." The following weekend brought Jake back to the Serafina with a backpack full of library books and a notebook filled with research findings. His enthusiasm for the mystery had only grown during the week, and he'd apparently spent considerable time at the school library investigating World War II naval operations. "Dad, you're not going to believe what I found," Jake said before he'd even climbed all the way down into the main cabin. He pulled a thick book from his backpack and opened it to a marked page. "Look, Operation Seahorse was real, and it was way more important than we thought." Noah accepted the book and read the passage Jake indicated. According to the text, Operation Seahorse had been a joint Navy OSS program that used civilian vessels and crews for intelligence gathering, supply runs to resistance groups, and recovery of personnel and materials from behind enemy lines. The operation had continued well into the 1950s, evolving from wartime missions to Cold War intelligence work. "This is good research, Jake. Where did you find this?" "Mrs. Patterson helped me. She's the reference librarian, and she knows a lot about military history. She said most of this stuff was classified until the 1990s, but now there are academic books about it." Jake pulled out another book, this one specifically about covert naval operations in the Pacific. "And look at this. There's a whole chapter about treasure recovery missions." "Treasure recovery?" "Not like pirate treasure," Jake explained, settling into the dinette across from his father. "Cultural treasures. Art, historical artifacts, things that were stolen by the Japanese or that needed to be protected from bombing. The book says there were special missions to recover stuff and get it to safe locations." Noah felt a chill of recognition. That would explain the careful construction of the Serafina's hidden compartments, the detailed charts showing secure anchorages, the photographs of Marcus with groups of serious-looking men. "Did Mrs. Patterson say anything else about these operations?" "She said a lot of the records are still classified, but there are hints that some of the recovered materials were never officially returned to museums or governments. She thinks maybe some of it was kept in private hands for safekeeping until political situations stabilized." The implications were staggering. If Uncle Marcus had been involved in recovering cultural treasures, and if some of those treasures had never been officially repatriated, then the Serafina might be more than just a hiding place for old charts and photographs. "Jake, did you tell Mrs. Patterson about what we found on the boat?" No, I just said I was doing research for a school project about World War II naval operations. But Dad, I think we need to search the boat more carefully. If Uncle Marcus was involved in treasure recovery, and if he left us all these clues, maybe he left us something more than just charts. Noah had been thinking the same thing. During the week, he'd made preliminary searches of the obvious storage areas, but hadn't found anything else unusual. However, Jake's research suggested they should be looking for more sophisticated hiding places. Okay, Noah said. Let's approach this systematically. We'll examine every compartment, every panel, every area that could potentially conceal something. They started with the areas they hadn't fully explored, the forward cabin, the spaces beneath the bunks, the storage lockers that ran along the hull. Jake proved to have an excellent eye for details that didn't quite fit, and within an hour he'd identified 3 more panels that appeared to have been modified from their original configuration. The first panel, located beneath the forward berth, opened to reveal another cache of documents. These were different from the charts they'd found earlier, official-looking papers with government seals, what appeared to be shipping manifests, and several photographs of wooden crates being loaded onto boats. "Dad, look at this," Jake said, holding up one of the shipping manifests. It's dated 1947, and it lists cultural materials for safekeeping, with a destination marked as Secure Storage West Coast. Noah examined the document more carefully. It was signed by someone with the title Cultural Recovery Officer and bore the seal of the Office of Strategic Services. The manifest listed dozens of items, paintings, sculptures, rare books, historical documents, with notations about their origin and condition. "This is incredible," Noah murmured. Uncle Marcus wasn't just involved in these operations. She was apparently in charge of them, at least on this coast. The second hidden panel yielded an even more intriguing discovery, a logbook, written in Marcus's careful handwriting, but in some kind of code. Each entry consisted of dates, coordinates, and series of numbers and letters that clearly meant something but weren't immediately comprehensible. "It's encrypted," Noah said, flipping through pages of coded entries that spanned from 1946 to 1963. Marcus was keeping detailed records of something, but he didn't want casual readers to understand what. Jake leaned over the logbook with fascination. "Can we decode it?" "Maybe. I learned some basic cryptography in the Coast Guard, not much, but enough to recognize common patterns. This looks like it might be a substitution cipher, which means each letter or number represents something else." The third panel contained the most surprising discovery. Yet a small waterproof case containing what appeared to be authentication documents. Each document bore official seals and signatures, certifying the provenance and value of specific artworks and cultural artifacts. The dollar amounts listed made Noah's breath catch. "Dad," Jake said quietly, "some of these are worth millions of dollars. Look, this painting is valued at 12 million, and this sculpture at 8 million. Noah studied the authentication papers with growing amazement. The items listed included works by famous artists, ancient artifacts from various cultures, and historical documents of international significance. If these papers were legitimate, and if the items they described still existed, they represented a treasure trove of incalculable cultural and monetary value. "But where are the actual items?" Jake asked. "These papers just prove they existed and were valuable. Where did Uncle Marcus hide the real stuff?" That was the key question. The charts, the photographs, the manifests, and now the authentication papers all pointed to the existence of a substantial collection of cultural treasures. But the treasures themselves remained hidden. Noah's phone buzzed with a text from his sister Carol. "Mom's birthday dinner is next Sunday. Try to show up looking respectable for once." The message reminded Noah that his family still viewed his boat-dwelling lifestyle as a temporary embarrassment, something he'd eventually outgrow and abandon. They had no idea that he was sitting on evidence of what might be the most significant treasure recovery operation in Pacific Coast history. "Dad," Jake said, looking up from the authentication papers, "what are we going to do with all this?" It was a good question. The responsible thing would probably be to contact authorities, the FBI maybe, or some kind of cultural recovery organization. But Marcus's letter had emphasized discretion, had warned that there might be people who would go to great lengths to possess whatever he'd hidden. "I think we need to understand more before we make any decisions," Noah said carefully. "We need to figure out what Uncle Marcus actually left us, and why he left it to us specifically." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "And we need to decode this logbook. I bet it tells us where everything is hidden." Over the next several hours, they worked on the encrypted logbook, using basic cryptographic techniques Noah remembered from his military training. The code proved to be more sophisticated than a simple substitution cipher, but gradually patterns began to emerge. The breakthrough came when Jake noticed that certain number sequences appeared repeatedly throughout the logbook, always in conjunction with specific dates. "Dad, what if these numbers are coordinates? Look, this sequence appears on 12 different dates, always with notes about delivery completed or storage secured." Noah checked the numbers against the nautical charts they'd found. Sure enough, the coordinates corresponded to locations marked on the chart-specific anchorages, underwater features, and coastal landmarks that Marcus had carefully documented. "You're right," Noah said with excitement. "The logbook is a record of where things were hidden. Marcus was keeping track of multiple storage locations, probably as a security measure." As the afternoon progressed, they decoded more entries, gradually building a picture of an extensive network of hidden caches throughout the coastal waters of Southern California. Each location was carefully documented with coordinates, depth soundings, and notes about access conditions and security measures. "Dad, this is like a treasure map," Jake said, his voice filled with wonder. "Uncle Marcus left us an actual treasure map." But as Noah studied the decoded entries more carefully, he began to notice something troubling. Many of the locations were marked with additional notations: compromised, relocated, or status unknown. It appeared that over the years, Marcus had been forced to move or abandon various hiding places. "Jake, look at this pattern," Noah said, pointing to a series of entries from the 1980s. Marcus was having problems. Some of his storage locations were being discovered or threatened. He was moving things around, consolidating collections, trying to keep them secure. "What kind of problems?" "I'm not sure, but look at these notes: unauthorized interest, surveillance detected, immediate relocation required. It sounds like someone else was looking for the same things Marcus was trying to protect." The realization added a new dimension to their mystery. This wasn't just about finding hidden treasure, it was about understanding why that treasure had needed to remain hidden for so long, and whether the threats Marcus had been concerned about still existed. Jake looked up from the logbook with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Dad, what if we're not the only ones who know about this? What if other people are still looking for Uncle Marcus's treasure?" Noah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Marcus's letter had warned about people who would go to great lengths to possess what he'd hidden. Looking at the evidence spread across their small table documents worth millions, authentication papers for priceless cultural artifacts, detailed maps of hidden storage locations, Noah began to understand that they might have inherited more than just a mystery. They might have inherited a danger that had been carefully hidden for 70 years, waiting for someone curious enough and capable enough to uncover it. And now that someone was Noah and his 12-year-old son, sitting alone on a boat in a quiet marina, surrounded by secrets that powerful people had spent decades trying to find. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the marina. Noah was working on the Serafina's deck drainage system when he noticed a well-dressed woman in her 50s walking purposefully down the dock, checking boat names as she went. Something about her bearing professional, alert, completely out of place among the casual marina crowd made Noah pause in his work. She stopped at the Serafina and looked up at Noah with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Briggs, Noah Briggs." "That's right," Noah said, setting down his tools but not climbing down from the boat. "Can I help you?" "I hope so. My name is Catherine Wells." I represent a consortium of art recovery specialists who work with museums and private collectors to locate missing cultural artifacts. She handed him a business card that felt expensive between his fingers. I understand you recently inherited this vessel from Marcus Briggs. Noah felt his pulse quicken, but kept his expression neutral. That's correct. Marcus was my godfather. I'm sorry for your loss. Marcus was a remarkable man, though I suspect you're only beginning to understand just how remarkable. She glanced around the marina with the casual alertness of someone trained to notice details. I wonder if we might talk privately. I have information about your inheritance that might be of considerable interest to you. Every instinct Noah had developed during his Coast Guard years was telling him to be careful. This woman's arrival, just days after their discoveries, couldn't be coincidental. What kind of information? The kind that's best discussed away from public docks, she said with another practiced smile. Perhaps we could meet for coffee? There's a cafe just up the street from here. Noah climbed down to the dock, noting that Catherine Wells positioned herself to keep the Serafina in her peripheral vision, even while talking to him. Professional habit, or something more specific? Ms. Wells, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not sure what kind of art recovery information would be relevant to an old boat. Oh, but you see, it's not really just an old boat, is it? Her smile became more genuine and considerably more dangerous. Marcus Briggs was one of the most successful cultural recovery operatives of the 20th century. Over the course of 30 years, he was responsible for safeguarding hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art and artifacts that might otherwise have been lost forever. The casual revelation of information that Noah and Jake had spent days researching told him everything he needed to know about how much this woman already knew. And you think some of those artifacts might be connected to the boat? I think Marcus Briggs was far too careful an operator to die without ensuring his life's work was properly preserved. And I think he chose his heir very deliberately. She paused, studying Noah's face. You were a Coast Guard diver, weren't you? Specialized in underwater recovery operations? Noah didn't answer, but his silence seemed to confirm her expectations. My consortium has been tracking Marcus's activities for quite some time, she continued. We represent several museums and cultural institutions that are very interested in recovering materials that were placed in temporary safekeeping during various political upheavals. Materials that may have remained in private hands longer than originally intended. And you think I have information about these materials? I think Marcus left you more than just a boat, Mr. Briggs, and I think you're intelligent enough to realize that some discoveries are too significant to handle alone. Noah felt the weight of the decoded logbook, the authentication papers, and the detailed charts that were hidden below deck. Catherine Wells was right, the discoveries were significant. But her appearance raised questions about who else might know about Marcus's activities and what their intentions might be. What exactly are you proposing? Partnership. My consortium has resources, legal expertise, authentication services, secure storage facilities, connections with legitimate cultural institutions. We can help ensure that whatever Marcus left in your care finds its appropriate home, while also ensuring that you're properly compensated for your role in its recovery. And if I'm not interested in partnership? The smile disappeared entirely. Then you'll be attempting to handle a very complex situation without the expertise or resources necessary to do it safely. Cultural artifact recovery isn't just about finding things, Mr. Briggs. It's about navigating legal frameworks, international regulations, and occasionally some very determined people who believe they have prior claims to certain materials. The implicit threat was clear enough. Noah found himself thinking about Jake, about the excitement in his son's eyes when they'd been decoding the logbook together. Whatever Catherine Wells represented, Noah doubted her consortium had Jake's best interests at heart. I appreciate the offer, Noah said carefully, but I'm not sure I have anything that would interest your consortium. Like you said, it's just an old boat. Catherine Wells studied him for a long moment, then reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. It showed Marcus standing beside the Serafina, but this wasn't one of the photos they'd found hidden on the boat. This was recent. Marcus looked much older, and the Serafina looked exactly as she did now. This was taken 8 months ago, Mr. Briggs. 3 months before Marcus passed away. He was making final preparations for something. We believe he was consolidating his various collections, bringing everything to a single, secure location. She paused. We believe that location is your boat. Noah felt his mouth go dry. If Catherine Wells had been tracking Marcus that recently, if she had photographs and detailed knowledge of his activities, then she probably knew far more about the Serafina's secrets than Noah did. Even if that were true, Noah said, I wouldn't know anything about it. I barely knew Marcus. But you're learning, aren't you? I imagine you've been doing quite a bit of research lately, you and your son. The mention of Jake sent a chill down Noah's spine. How much had this woman been watching them? How long had she known about their discoveries? Miss Wells, I think this conversation is over. Of course. But before I go, let me leave you with something to consider. She handed him another business card, this one with only a phone number written on it. Marcus Briggs spent 70 years protecting certain materials because he understood their historical importance, but he also understood that they were only safe as long as they remained hidden. Once word gets out that they've been found, and word always gets out, Mr. Briggs, those materials become targets for people with far less noble intentions than my consortium. She turned to leave, then paused. You should also know that you're not the only one Marcus contacted about his legacy. There are other interested parties, some of whom are considerably less patient than we are. After she left, Noah stood on the dock for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Catherine Wells knew about the boat, knew about Marcus's activities, and apparently knew that Noah and Jake had been investigating their inheritance. The question was, how long had she been watching, and who else might be watching as well? When Jake arrived that afternoon, Noah was waiting with a serious expression and a carefully prepared explanation. We need to talk, kiddo, about the treasure hunt and about some complications that have come up. Jake climbed down into the cabin and immediately noticed his father's tension. What kind of complications? Noah described his encounter with Catherine Wells, being careful to present the facts without alarming Jake unnecessarily. But his son was too perceptive to miss the implications. She knows about everything we found, doesn't she? Jake asked. The charts, the logbook, all of it. She knows something. I'm not sure how much, but enough to be concerning. Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the kind of analytical thinking that impressed Noah. Dad, if Uncle Marcus was worried about people trying to find his treasure, and if he left us all these clues, maybe he expected this to happen. Maybe he wanted us to be prepared for it. What do you mean? Well, think about it. He could have just left us a note saying where everything was hidden. But instead he left us puzzles and codes and maps. Maybe he wanted to make sure we understood the situation before we found the actual treasure. Noah considered this. Jake might be right. Marcus had been a careful operator for 70 years. Every decision had been deliberate, including the decision to hide information in ways that required investigation and understanding. So what do you think we should do? Jake pulled out the decoded logbook and spread it across the table. I think we should finish what we started. Decode everything, find out exactly what Uncle Marcus left us, and then decide what to do with it. But we should be careful about who else knows what we're doing. Noah felt a surge of pride at his son's thoughtful approach, mixed with concern about involving a 12-year-old in what was becoming a genuinely dangerous situation. Jake, if there are other people looking for this treasure, people who might not be as polite as Ms. Wells, then maybe you should stay out of it. Maybe this is something I need to handle alone. No way, Jake said immediately. This is our mystery, Dad. Uncle Marcus left it to both of us, mentioned me in his letter, remember? And besides, I'm the one who figured out the coordinate code. You need me. Noah had to admit that Jake had been essential to their progress. The boy's eye for detail, his research skills, and his analytical thinking had been crucial to understanding Marcus's clues. Okay, Noah said finally, but we do this carefully. No more casual conversations about what we're finding. No more library research that might attract attention. And if I say we stop, we stop. Agreed? Agreed, but Dad, I have an idea about how we can be more careful. Jake pulled out his notebook and opened it to a page covered with sketches and notes. What if we don't try to recover everything at once? What if we start with just one location, something small and manageable, just to see what we're really dealing with? Noah studied Jake's notes. His son had identified several locations from the logbook that were relatively close to their marina, places that could be reached in a day trip and investigated without major equipment or extended absence. This one, Jake said, pointing to a set of coordinates about 10 miles north of their current location. According to the logbook, it's a small cache, probably just documents and maybe some smaller artifacts. And look, Uncle Marcus's last entry about this location was just 2 years ago. He wrote, "Contents verified, security maintained." Meaning, whatever's there is probably still there. Exactly. And if we can find this one, we'll know that the logbook is accurate and that Uncle Marcus really did leave us a treasure hunt. Plus, we'll have a better idea of what we're dealing with before we make any decisions about the bigger locations. Noah looked at his son's eager face and felt the familiar tension between protective instinct and respect for Jake's capabilities. The boy was right. They needed to understand the scope of what Marcus had left them before they could make informed decisions about how to handle it. And despite the appearance of Catherine Wells and her implied threats, Noah found himself genuinely excited about the prospect of using his diving skills for something more meaningful than insurance claim investigations. "Okay," Noah said. "We'll try one location, but we plan it carefully. We tell no one about it, and we're prepared to abandon the whole thing if it feels unsafe." Jake grinned with satisfaction. "When do we start?" Noah looked at the charts, the decoded coordinates, and his son's hopeful expression. 3 months ago, his biggest adventure had been figuring out how to work the boat's temperamental hot water heater. Now he was planning what amounted to a treasure-hunting expedition based on clues left by a godfather who'd apparently been involved in covert operations for 7 decades. "We start by making sure the Serafina is ready for some serious navigation," Noah said. "If we're going treasure hunting, we're going to do it right." The discovery came on Thursday morning, wrapped in plastic and wedged behind a support beam in the engine compartment where no casual inspection would ever find it. Jake had been helping Noah replace corroded fuel lines when his flashlight beam caught the edge of something that didn't belong. "Dad, there's something else back here," Jake called out, his voice muffled by the tight confines of the engine space. Noah squeezed in beside his son and followed the beam of the flashlight. Behind the main engine mount, carefully secured to avoid any contact with moving parts, was a rectangular package wrapped in heavy plastic and sealed with waterproof tape. "How did we miss this before?" Noah muttered, carefully extracting the package from its hiding place. "Because Uncle Marcus was really good at hiding things," Jake said with admiration. "Look how it's positioned. You'd have to be doing major engine work to find it, and even then, you'd have to be looking for it." Back in the main cabin, they carefully unwrapped the package to reveal what appeared to be the most significant find yet. A professional-quality underwater camera in a waterproof housing, along with several rolls of film and a detailed dive log dating from the 1990s through 2010. The dive log was filled with Marcus's meticulous handwriting, documenting dozens of underwater expeditions to various locations along the California coast. Each entry included precise coordinates, depth measurements, bottom conditions, and detailed descriptions of what appeared to be underwater storage installations. "Dad, look at this entry," Jake said, pointing to a log page dated just 3 years earlier. "Uncle Marcus was still doing underwater work when he was in his 80s, and look what he found." Noah read the entry Jake indicated. It described a dive to a location about 15 miles offshore, where Marcus had documented collection point 7 contents intact, seals holding. Estimated value unchanged at $47 million. The entry was accompanied by underwater photographs showing what appeared to be a sophisticated storage chamber built into an underwater rock formation. $47 million, Jake whispered, in just one location. Noah flipped through more pages of the dive log, finding similar entries documenting multiple underwater storage sites. The scope of Marcus's operation was staggering: dozens of locations, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cultural artifacts, all carefully hidden and regularly maintained over the course of decades. Jake, your uncle wasn't just hiding things randomly. He built a whole network of secure storage sites, and he was maintaining them right up until he got too old to dive. But now he can't maintain them anymore, Jake said, understanding the implication immediately. That's why he left everything to you. He needed someone who could continue the work. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus had spent 70 years protecting these materials, using skills and resources that Noah could barely imagine. Now that responsibility was apparently being passed to an unemployed salvage worker living on a leaky boat. Noah's phone buzzed with a text from Linda. Jake's teacher called. He's been asking a lot of questions about World War II and cultural artifact recovery. She's concerned he might be getting involved in something inappropriate. Call me. The message reminded Noah of the risks they were taking, not just to themselves, but to Jake's relationship with his mother and his normal 12-year-old life. Jake, we need to talk about something. Your mom is getting concerned about your research, and frankly, so am I. This is turning into something much bigger and more dangerous than I expected. Jake looked up from the dive log with a serious expression. Dad, do you remember what you told me about the Coast Guard? About how sometimes you had to do difficult things because they were the right things to do. This is different, kiddo. This involves millions of dollars and people who might be willing to do bad things to get it. But that's exactly why it matters, Jake insisted. Uncle Marcus spent his whole life protecting these treasures because they were important to history, to culture, to people. If we just walk away now, what happens to all that work? What happens to the treasures? Noah studied his son's earnest face and realized that Jake understood the stakes better than he'd given him credit for. This wasn't just about treasure hunting or adventure. It was about stewardship, about continuing work that Marcus had deemed important enough to dedicate his life to. You're right, Noah said finally, but that means we have to be smarter about how we handle this. More careful, more professional. What do you mean? Noah pulled out the nautical charts they'd decoded and spread them across the table alongside the dive log. Look at how Uncle Marcus approached this. Every location carefully chosen, every storage method tested and maintained. He didn't take unnecessary risks, and he didn't involve people who couldn't handle the responsibility. So what do? We prepare properly. We study these dive logs until we understand exactly what Marcus was doing and how he was doing it. We upgrade our equipment to match the requirements. And we start with the easiest, safest location to see if we can actually handle this responsibility. Jake nodded eagerly. The location I picked out, the one 10 miles north. According to the dive log, it's only 40 feet deep, and Marcus described it as straightforward recovery, minimal equipment required. Noah checked the dive log entry Jake referenced. Marcus had last visited the site 18 months ago, documenting Collection Point 12 small cache, primarily documents and portable artifacts, estimated value $2.3 million, easily accessible for qualified diver. $2.3 million. Even the small cache contained more money than Noah had ever dreamed of possessing. But as he read Marcus's detailed notes about the site, he began to understand that this wasn't really about money. It was about protecting pieces of human history that had been entrusted to Marcus's care. Okay, Noah said. We'll plan a reconnaissance dive to Collection Point 12, but we do it right: proper equipment, proper safety protocols, proper planning. And Jake, you stay on the boat while I dive. This isn't a family adventure anymore. But Dad, no arguments. If I'm going to take on Uncle Marcus's responsibility, I'm going to do it professionally. That means following proper safety procedures, and that means you stay topside as my surface support. Jake looked disappointed but nodded his acceptance. When do we go? Noah studied the weather reports, the tide charts, and Marcus's detailed notes about optimal conditions for accessing Collection Point 12. Saturday morning. Weather's supposed to be calm, Visibility should be good, and we'll have the whole day if we need it. The next 2 days passed in intensive preparation. Noah reviewed his diving skills, tested equipment, and studied Marcus's meticulous notes about underwater storage techniques. Jake proved invaluable as a research assistant, memorizing the dive log entries and helping Noah understand the technical details of Marcus's storage systems. By Friday evening, they had assembled everything they needed for the expedition. Diving equipment that Noah had borrowed from his old Coast Guard contacts, underwater tools for opening sealed containers, waterproof cameras for documenting whatever they found, and detailed charts showing the exact location and approach routes to Collection Point 12. "Dad," Jake said as they reviewed their plans one final time, "what if we find something really important? What if it's something that belongs in a museum or something?" "Then we'll make sure it gets where it belongs," Noah promised. "That's what Uncle Marcus would have wanted, and that's what we're going to do." Jake nodded solemnly. "And what if that woman, Ms. Wells, finds out what we're doing?" Noah had been thinking about that possibility all week. Catherine Wells clearly had resources and connections that extended far beyond what she'd revealed. If she was monitoring their activities, she might already know about their planned expedition. "Then we deal with that when it happens," Noah said. "But Jake, I want you to promise me something. If anything goes wrong, if we encounter other boats at the site, if anyone approaches us who seems threatening, if I don't surface when I'm supposed to, you get on the radio immediately and call the Coast Guard. Don't try to handle it yourself. Don't wait to see what happens. Just call for help." "I promise, Dad." That night, Noah lay in his bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the marina and thinking about the responsibility Marcus had placed on his shoulders. Tomorrow, he would make his first dive as the guardian of 70 years' worth of hidden cultural treasures. He would either prove himself worthy of Marcus's trust, or he would discover that some legacies are too complex for ordinary people to handle. Either way, his life as a simple marina resident living on an old boat was about to end. Tomorrow, Noah Briggs would become something he'd never expected to be, the inheritor of one of the most significant treasure recovery operations in modern history. As he drifted off to sleep, Noah found himself hoping that Jake was right, that Uncle Marcus had chosen his heir wisely, and that a former Coast Guard diver and his 12-year-old son were capable of protecting secrets that had been hidden beneath the ocean for decades. The dive to Collection Point 12 should have been routine. Noah had made similar dives hundreds of times during his Coast Guard. Years 40 feet of clear water, good visibility, straightforward bottom conditions. But as he descended toward the coordinates Marcus had documented, he realized that nothing about his inheritance was going to be routine. The underwater storage site was a masterpiece of engineering. Built into a natural rock formation on the sea floor, the installation looked like something designed by the military for long-term security. Heavy metal panels sealed what appeared to be multiple chambers, each protected by sophisticated locks that had survived decades of submersion without visible corrosion. But that wasn't the surprise that made Noah's heart race inside his diving mask. The surprise was the fresh tool marks around one of the access panels and the modern diving equipment that lay scattered on the sea floor nearby equipment that hadn't been there long enough to accumulate marine growth. Someone else had been here recently, someone with professional diving gear and the knowledge to open Marcus's carefully secured storage chambers. Noah surfaced quickly, pulling himself up the boat's ladder with more urgency than planned. Jake was waiting anxiously, having monitored the dive from the cockpit. "Dad, what happened? You're back early." "We're not alone down there," Noah said, pulling off his diving mask and reaching for the marine radio. "Someone else has been working that site, and recently." Before he could key the radio, they heard the sound of approaching engines. 2 boats were heading their way, a large sport fisher and a smaller, rigid, inflatable boat that moved with the purposeful speed of a military or law enforcement vessel. "Jake, get the dive gear secured and be ready to move," Noah said, his Coast Guard training kicking in automatically. "Something's not right about this." The sport fisher arrived first, pulling alongside the Serafina with the kind of precision that suggested experienced boat handlers. Noah recognized Catherine Wells immediately, but she wasn't alone. 3 men in diving gear were with her, along with someone who looked like he spent more time in boardrooms than on boats. "Good morning, Mr. Briggs," Catherine Wells called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day for diving, isn't it?" "Ms. Wells, I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Oh, but you should have been. You see, we've been monitoring this location for quite some time. When our underwater sensors detected diving activity this morning, we naturally came to investigate." Underwater sensors. Noah felt a chill as he realized the implications. Catherine Wells wasn't just tracking Marcus's activity-ish, he had active surveillance on his storage sites, probably on all of them. "Mr. Briggs," the man in the business suit called out, "my name is David Chen. I represent certain interests that have been very patient in waiting for Marcus Briggs to fulfill his obligations. Now that he's passed away, those obligations transfer to his heir." "What obligations?" "The obligation to return cultural artifacts to their rightful owners," Chen replied smoothly. "Marcus was supposed to be a temporary custodian, not a permanent guardian. Many of our clients have been waiting decades for the return of their property." Jake moved closer to his father, and Noah noticed that his son was quietly reaching for the marine radio. Good boy, remembering the emergency protocols they'd discussed. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," Noah said, buying time while he assessed the situation. The second boat, the RIB, had positioned itself between the Serafina and the open ocean. They were effectively trapped. "Oh, I think you are," Catherine Wells said. "We know you've found Marcus's records. We know you've decoded his storage locations. And we know you've just discovered that Collection Point 12 has been partially excavated." "By whom?" "By us, of course. We've been systematically recovering materials from Marcus's various sites for the past 6 months. This location yielded some particularly interesting items: 15th century manuscripts, several pieces of Asian art, some remarkable pre-Columbian artifacts." Noah felt sick. Marcus had spent 70 years protecting these materials, and within months of his death, people were looting his carefully maintained storage sites. "Those artifacts were being protected," Noah said. "Marcus was keeping them safe until they could be properly returned." David Chen laughed, a cold sound that carried clearly across the water. "Marcus Briggs was a thief, Mr. Briggs. A very sophisticated thief who convinced himself he was performing some kind of public service, but a thief nonetheless. Those artifacts belong to specific institutions and private collectors who have legal claim to them." "Then why haven't you gone through legal channels to recover them?" "Because Marcus was very careful about documentation," Catherine Wells explained. "Many of these items exist in a legal grey area covered during wartime, held in private custody during periods of political instability, never officially catalogued by their current legal owners. It's much simpler to recover them directly than to navigate decades of complex ownership claims." Jake had managed to reach the radio and was quietly trying to establish contact with the Coast Guard. Noah hoped his son could get through without attracting attention, but the men on the sport fisher were clearly professionals who didn't miss much. "Mr. Briggs," Chen continued, "we're prepared to offer you a very reasonable settlement for your cooperation. $1 million, cash, in exchange for Marcus's complete records and your assistance in locating the remaining storage sites." $1 million. It was more money than Noah had ever imagined, possessing enough to solve every financial problem he'd had since losing his job. But looking at Jake's determined face as he worked with the radio, Noah realized that some things were more important than money. "And if I refuse?" "Then we'll recover the materials anyway, but you won't benefit from the process," Chen said with a shrug. "We already have most of Marcus's locations identified. You'd simply be making things more difficult for everyone involved." Noah was about to respond when Jake's voice cut through the conversation. "Mayday! Mayday! This is sailing vessel Serafina. We are being threatened by unknown vessels at position." He rattled off their GPS coordinates with the precision of someone who'd memorized emergency procedures. One of the men on the sport fisher moved toward what looked like electronic jamming equipment, but before he could activate it, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air. A Coast Guard helicopter appeared from the direction of shore, moving fast and low. Catherine Wells looked annoyed but not particularly concerned. "Mr. Briggs, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be." The helicopter circled their position, while the pilot's voice crackled over the marine radio. "Vessels in vicinity of distress call, this is Coast Guard Rescue 6502. State your intentions and status." Noah grabbed the radio from Jake. "Coast Guard Rescue 6502, this is Noah Briggs aboard sailing vessel Serafina. We have two vessels that approached us in an aggressive manner while we were conducting legitimate diving operations." "Copy that, Serafina. We're deploying a boarding team." David Chen spoke rapidly into his own radio, and within minutes, Noah could see another helicopter approaching from the South Knot Coast Guard, but some kind of private aircraft. "Mr. Briggs," Catherine Wells called out, her tone now urgent, "you need to understand that this situation involves national security interests. The materials Marcus was protecting include items that certain government agencies prefer to keep out of public attention." "What kind of items?" "The kind that could embarrass certain allies, reveal certain operations that officially never happened, document certain agreements that were never meant to be public knowledge." The Coast Guard helicopter was hovering directly overhead now, and Noah could see rescue swimmers preparing to deploy. But he could also see that the private helicopter was taking up a position that would complicate any rescue operation. "Dad," Jake said quietly, "I think we're in the middle of something way bigger than treasure hunting." Noah had reached the same conclusion. This wasn't just about recovering cultural artifacts, it was about controlling information that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. Marcus hadn't just been protecting art and historical objects, he'd been protecting secrets that could apparently threaten national security interests. "Ms. Wells," Noah called out, "if these materials are so sensitive, why hasn't the government simply classified them and taken control of them officially?" "Because officially they don't exist. Marcus's operation was always deniable, always off the books. The materials he recovered were never officially catalogued, never officially acknowledged. As far as the government is concerned, they simply disappeared during various wartime confusions." The Coast Guard rescue swimmer hit the water and began swimming toward the Serafina, but the private helicopter was now broadcasting on emergency frequencies, claiming to be conducting a classified federal operation and requesting that all other aircraft clear the area. Noah looked at Jake, at the Coast Guard swimmer approaching their boat, at the two vessels full of people who claimed legal right to Marcus's lifetime of work, and at the helicopters circling overhead in an increasingly complex standoff. "Dad," Jake said, "what do we do now?" Noah realized that the answer to that question would determine not just their immediate safety, but the fate of 70 years' worth of cultural treasures that Marcus had died protecting. And he was running out of time to figure out who was telling the truth about what those treasures really were, and why they mattered enough for people to risk this kind of confrontation. "Now," Noah said, reaching for the wooden box that contained Marcus's original letter, "we find out what Uncle Marcus really wanted us to know." As he opened the box, Noah noticed something they'd missed before a sealed envelope marked, "Open only in emergency." Given the helicopters, the armed men, and the increasingly dangerous situation developing around them, Noah figured this definitely qualified as an emergency. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with a brief message in Marcus's handwriting. "If you're reading this, then they found you sooner than I hoped. What I never told you is that I didn't just work for the government during the war. I worked for multiple governments, and some of the agreements I made were never supposed to be revealed. The real treasure isn't the art and artifacts. The real treasure is the documentation of who knew what, when they knew it, and what they agreed to keep secret. Be very careful who you trust. The people who seem to be helping you may not be on your side." Noah looked up at the chaos surrounding their small boat and realized that everything he thought he knew about their situation had just changed. The treasure hunt was over. Now they were in the middle of a 70-year-old conspiracy that involved secrets some very powerful people were willing to kill to protect. The Coast Guard cutter arrived 2 hours later, effectively ending the immediate standoff but beginning something far more complex. Noah and Jake found themselves in the unusual position of being simultaneously rescued and detained, interviewed by federal agents while being protected by the same agency that had responded to their distress call. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, the cutter's commanding officer, was a 20-year veteran with the kind of calm authority that came from handling maritime emergencies. She listened to Noah's account of the morning's events with professional skepticism, taking notes but asking few questions until he mentioned Marcus's name. "Marcus Briggs," she repeated. "That name came up in a briefing I received yesterday. There are multiple federal agencies interested in materials he may have left behind." "What kind of agencies?" "The kind that don't usually explain their interest to civilians," Martinez replied. "Mr. Briggs, I need you to understand something. The Coast Guard's primary concern is maritime safety and security. We responded to your distress call because that's our job. But now we're dealing with a situation that involves multiple agencies with conflicting jurisdictions and interests." Jake had been quiet during most of the interview, but now he spoke up. "Commander Martinez, my dad hasn't done anything wrong. We were just trying to understand what our uncle left us." "I believe that, son. But unfortunately, what your uncle left you appears to be more complicated than anyone expected." Martinez led them to the cutter's communications center, where she'd been receiving a steady stream of messages from various federal agencies. The activity level suggested that their morning dive had triggered responses from organizations Noah had never heard of. "Mr. Briggs, I'm going to be direct with you. There are people who want to speak with you, who have the authority to make this conversation mandatory rather than voluntary. My recommendation is that you cooperate fully with the investigation, but that you also exercise your right to legal representation." "Are we under arrest?" "No, but you're not exactly free to leave either. The materials you inherited appear to involve national security issues that go back decades. Until those issues are resolved, you and your son are going to be under federal protection." "Protection from what?" "From people who might be willing to use force to obtain information you possess," Martinez said grimly. "The individuals who approached you this morning represent interests that operate outside normal legal frameworks. They're not necessarily criminal, but they're not necessarily constrained by law either." A young petty officer appeared in the doorway. "Commander, Agent Harrison from Justice is requesting to speak with Mr. Briggs immediately." "Tell Agent Harrison that Mr. Briggs will be available after he's had a chance to contact legal counsel," Martinez replied. "And remind the agent that Mr. Briggs is currently under Coast Guard protection." After the petty officer left, Martinez turned back to Noah with an expression of concern. "Mr. Briggs, how much do you really know about your uncle's activities?" "More than I did a week ago. Less than I probably should," Noah admitted. "It's becoming clear that he was involved in things that were way beyond what he ever told the family. The preliminary information we've received suggests that Marcus Briggs was involved in cultural recovery operations that continued long after the war ended. Some of those operations involved materials that certain parties prefer to keep out of public attention." Jake pulled out the notebook where he'd been recording their discoveries. "Commander Martinez, we've been trying to figure out Uncle Marcus's puzzles for weeks. We found charts and codes and photographs, but we never found anything that seemed dangerous or illegal." Martinez examined Jake's carefully organized notes with professional interest. "This is impressive work, son. You've documented locations, dates, patterns of activity spanning decades. My son has been invaluable in decoding Uncle Marcus's records," Noah said with pride. "He's the one who figured out most of the coordinate systems and timing patterns." "Well, that may be exactly why certain people are so interested in speaking with you both," Martinez said. "If you've successfully decoded Marcus's storage system, you possess information that multiple agencies have been trying to access for years." Noah felt a chill. "Are you saying we've put ourselves in danger by trying to solve Uncle Marcus's puzzles?" "I'm saying that knowledge can be dangerous, especially knowledge about operations that were supposed to remain classified indefinitely. The radio crackled with another incoming message, and Martinez listened to it with increasing concern. After acknowledging the communication, she turned back to Noah and Jake with an expression that had shifted from professional concern to personal worry. "Mr. Briggs, I just received word that there's been unusual activity at several other locations along the coast locations that match coordinates found in materials recovered from your boat. It appears that this morning's confrontation was just the beginning of a much larger operation." "What kind of operation?" "The systematic recovery of materials from underwater storage sites. Someone is using your uncle's information to locate and excavate his entire network of hidden caches." Jake looked up from his notebook with alarm. "But they can't do that without the complete coordinate system. We never gave them our decoded information." "No, but you may not be the only ones who've been working on Marcus's puzzles," Martinez said. "Intelligence agencies have resources and expertise that go far beyond what civilian researchers can access. If they've been monitoring Marcus's activities for years, they may have developed their own understanding of his storage system." Noah thought about Catherine Wells, about her detailed knowledge of Marcus's activities, about the underwater sensors she'd mentioned. "Commander, I think these people have been planning this operation for a long time. Our investigation may have simply provided them with the final pieces they needed." "That's what concerns me," Martinez agreed. "And it's why you're not going anywhere until we understand exactly what's happening and who's behind it." The next few hours passed in a blur of interviews, briefings, and increasingly tense radio communications. Federal agents from multiple agencies arrived on the cutter, each with their own questions and theories about Marcus's activities. Noah found himself repeating the same information over and over, while Jake meticulously answered questions about their decoding process and the contents of their discoveries. By late afternoon, a clearer picture had emerged. Marcus Briggs hadn't just been involved in wartime cultural recovery, he'd been part of a network of operatives who'd continued similar activities throughout the Cold War and beyond. The materials he'd protected weren't just art and artifacts. They included documentation of covert operations, evidence of agreements between governments that had never been officially acknowledged, and proof of activities that multiple nations preferred to keep classified. "The problem," explained Agent Harrison from the Justice Department, "is that Marcus operated with considerable autonomy over the decades. He made decisions about what to protect and what to reveal based on his own judgment rather than official oversight. Some of the materials he preserved could be embarrassing or damaging to current diplomatic relationships. But that's exactly why he protected them, isn't it?" Jake asked with the kind of clarity that cut through adult complications. "He kept them safe until it was okay to reveal them, or until someone trustworthy could decide what to do with them." Agent Harrison studied Jake with interest. "That's a remarkably sophisticated understanding of the situation, young man. But the challenge is determining what Marcus considered okay to reveal and who he thought was trustworthy to make those decisions." Noah felt the weight of Marcus's legacy settling on his shoulders. "He chose me. Whatever his reasons, he decided I was the person who should inherit this responsibility." "Yes, but did he expect you to continue protecting these materials indefinitely, or did he expect you to make them public?" Harrison asked. "And how could he have anticipated the current political climate, the relationships between nations that have changed dramatically since he made his original decisions?" Lieutenant Commander Martinez interrupted the conversation with an urgent radio message. "Mr. Briggs, we've got a problem. The vessel that approached you this morning, the Sportfisher with Catherine Welsitz, been spotted near another set of coordinates from your uncle's charts, and they're not alone. We're tracking at least 4 other vessels converging on underwater locations along the coast." Noah studied the chart Martinez spread across the table. Red markers indicated known positions of various vessels, all clustered around locations that matched Marcus's storage sites. It looked like a coordinated salvage operation covering hundreds of miles of coastline. "They're not just trying to recover individual items," Noah realized. "They're attempting to excavate Marcus's entire network before anyone can stop them." "That's our assessment as well," Harrison agreed. which means we need to make some decisions quickly. Either we allow this private recovery operation to continue, potentially losing control of materials with national security implications, or we intervene officially, which means acknowledging that these materials exist and that the government has an interest in them. Jake looked up from his notebook where he'd been tracking the vessel positions. What if there's a third option? What if we get there first? What do you mean? Uncle Marcus spent 70 years protecting these materials. He left us the information we needed to find them, but he also left us the Serafina. What if he expected us to recover the materials ourselves, to make sure they ended up where they were supposed to go? Martinez shook her head. Son, that would put you directly in harm's way. These people have demonstrated they're willing to use force to achieve their objectives. But they're not expecting us to take the initiative, Noah said, understanding Jake's logic. They think we're victims, not participants. They're focused on systematic recovery operations, not on the possibility that Marcus's heir might be actively working against them. Agent Harrison leaned forward with interest. Mr. Briggs, are you suggesting some kind of cooperative operation with federal agencies? I'm suggesting that Marcus chose me for a reason. I have the diving skills, I have the boat, and I have the information needed to access his storage sites. More importantly, I understand what Marcus was trying to protect and why it mattered to him. And I have the decoded coordinates and timing information, Jake added. I know which sites are most important, which ones Uncle Marcus visited most recently, and which ones contain the most sensitive materials. Martinez looked skeptical. Even if we agreed to such an operation, the risks would be enormous. You'd be operating in waters where hostile vessels are actively searching for the same objectives. The potential for confrontation would be extremely high. But the alternative is letting 70 years of careful preservation work fall into the hands of people who may not share Marcus's commitment to protecting cultural heritage, Noah argued. Commander, you know as well as I do that some things are worth taking risks to protect. The radio crackled with another urgent message. Martinez listened, then turned to the group with a grim expression. That was our aerial surveillance. The private vessels have successfully excavated at least 2 storage sites in the past 4 hours. They're moving fast and they're well equipped. Agent Harrison stood and walked to the chart table, studying the pattern of recovery operations. If they maintain this pace, they'll have accessed the majority of Marcus's storage network within 48 hours. After that, the question of what to do with these materials becomes academic. Noah looked at Jake, at the charts showing the systematic destruction of Marcus's life work, and at the federal agents who were clearly struggling with competing priorities and jurisdictions. Marcus had spent 7 decades protecting materials he believed were important to history and culture. Now those materials were being recovered by people whose primary motivation seemed to be profit rather than preservation. Commander Martinez, Noah said, I formally request permission to return to my vessel and continue the activities I was engaged in when your personnel rescued me this morning. Mr. Briggs, I can't authorize you to put yourself in danger. Then don't authorize it. Just don't prevent it. Noah turned to Agent Harrison. Sir, I inherited a responsibility from a man who spent his life protecting cultural heritage. I'm not going to abandon that responsibility because it's become complicated or dangerous. Jake closed his notebook and looked up at the adults surrounding him. And I'm not going to let my dad handle this alone. Uncle Marcus mentioned me in his letter for a reason. He knew we'd have to work together to understand what he left us. Martinez and Harrison exchanged glances, clearly weighing factors that Noah couldn't fully understand. Finally, Martinez spoke. Mr. Briggs, if you're determined to continue this operation, the Coast Guard can provide limited support communications monitoring, emergency response capability, aerial surveillance, but we cannot officially sanction what would essentially be a civilian treasure recovery operation in contested waters. And the Justice Department can provide legal cover for materials that are recovered through legitimate means, Harrison added carefully. If cultural artifacts are properly documented and voluntarily surrendered to appropriate authorities, there would be no criminal liability for the recovery process itself. Noah felt a surge of gratitude for these professionals who were finding ways to help within the constraints of their official responsibilities. What do we need to do? Martinez pulled out a secure communications device. First, we establish reliable contact protocols. If you're going to be operating independently, we need to know your position and status at all times. Harrison produced a stack of legal documents. Second, we document everything properly. Any materials you recover need to be catalogued, photographed, and handled according to federal guidelines for cultural artifacts. Jake reopened his notebook to a fresh page. And third, we figure out which sites are most important and plan our operations to get there before the other people do. Looking at his son's determined expression, at the federal agents who were risking their careers to provide support, and at the charts showing Marcus's life work being systematically destroyed, Noah realized that his quiet life as a marina resident was definitively over. Tomorrow, he and Jake would return to the Serafina and begin the most important mission of Noah's life, racing against professional treasure hunters to protect the legacy of a man who had trusted them with secrets worth dying for. Dawn came grey and cold, with 3-foot swells that made the Serafina roll gently at anchor above Collection Point 7, the storage site that Marcus's dive logs identified as containing the most sensitive materials. Noah had chosen this location not because it was safe, but because it represented the heart of whatever Marcus had been protecting for 70 years. Jake monitored the radio and GPS, while Noah made final checks on his diving equipment. The federal agents had provided them with secure communications gear and emergency beacons, but they were essentially operating alone in waters where at least 2 other vessels were conducting recovery operations. "Dad, I've got movement on radar," Jake called out quietly. 2 contacts about 3 miles southeast, heading this direction. Noah paused in his equipment check. They'd hoped to reach Collection Point 7 before Catherine Wells and her associates, but it appeared their window of opportunity was closing fast. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 30 minutes before they're in visual range," Jake estimated, using the radar skills Noah had taught him during their weekend navigation lessons. 30 minutes to dive to 60 feet, locate Marcus's most important storage installation, and recover materials that had been hidden for decades. Under normal circumstances, it would be a challenging dive. With hostile vessels approaching and the knowledge that they were racing against professional treasure hunters, it felt nearly impossible. "Jake, I need you to understand something," Noah said, pulling on his wetsuit. "If those boats get here before I surface, if anything goes wrong, you follow the emergency protocols we discussed. Radio the Coast Guard, activate the emergency beacon, and get the Serafina out of here. I'm not leaving you down there, Dad." "Yes, you are, if necessary." Noah looked at his son seriously. "Marcus trusted us with this responsibility, but my first responsibility is keeping you safe. Promise me." Jake nodded reluctantly. "I promise. But Dad, you're coming back up. You have to." Noah slipped over the side and began his descent toward the coordinates Marcus had marked as his most sensitive storage location. The water was clearer than he'd expected, and as he descended, he could see the seafloor taking shape below him, a rocky bottom with the kind of natural formations that would provide excellent concealment for underwater storage. At 50 feet, he found the first marker, a small bronze plaque embedded in the rock with the initials MB and an arrow pointing toward a crevice in the seafloor. Following the arrow, Noah discovered an opening that had been carefully modified to accommodate access while maintaining concealment. The entrance led to a partially natural, partially constructed chamber that was larger and more sophisticated than anything Noah had imagined. Marcus hadn't just hidden materials underwater, he'd built an underwater vault using a combination of natural rock formations and military-grade construction techniques. Inside the chamber, Noah found storage containers that appeared to be perfectly preserved despite decades of submersion. Each container was labeled with Marcus's meticulous cataloging system and sealed with technology that looked far more advanced than standard maritime storage methods. But as Noah began photographing the installation and preparing to move the first container, he realized he wasn't alone in the underwater chamber. Fresh tool marks on the storage containers indicated that someone else had been here recently, very recently, based on the lack of marine growth on the disturbed surfaces. Worse, as Noah turned to examine the chamber's entrance, he saw the glow of underwater lights approaching from outside. Another diver was entering the chamber, and based on the professional quality of his equipment and the deliberate nature of his approach, this wasn't a casual encounter. Noah's training kicked in automatically. In an underwater environment, confrontation was deadly for everyone involved. His only advantage was familiarity with the chamber layout and knowledge of the storage system that the other diver might not possess. Moving quickly but carefully, Noah positioned himself behind one of the larger storage containers and waited. The approaching diver entered the chamber with the confidence of someone who expected to work undisturbed, but paused when he saw Noah's lights and the evidence of activity around the storage containers. For a moment, both divers remained motionless, assessing the situation through their masks. Then the other diver began making hand signals that Noah recognized from his military training communications, indicating that he should surface immediately and that the area was under official control. Noah responded with his own signals, indicating that he was the legal inheritor of the site and that the other diver was trespassing. The exchange might have been comical under other circumstances, but 60 feet underwater with limited air supply, it had deadly serious implications. The standoff ended when Noah heard the sound of additional divers entering the chamber. Through the murky water, he could see at least 2 more sets of lights approaching, and his air gauge was showing that he had maybe 15 minutes of breathing gas remaining. Noah made a decision that Marcus would probably have approved of. Instead of trying to confront 3 professional divers in an underwater environment, he grabbed the smallest and most portable of the storage container zone that Marcus's notes had indicated contained documentation materials of higher sensitivity and headed for the chamber's secondary exit. Marcus's notes had mentioned multiple access points to the storage chamber, designed as security measures in case the primary entrance was compromised. Noah had studied the dive logs carefully enough to know that there should be a narrow passage leading to a different section of the rock formation. Finding the secondary passage required swimming through a restriction that was barely wide enough for a single diver, but it led to a smaller chamber that showed no signs of recent disturbance. From there, Noah could access a different route to the surface that would bring him up away from the Seraphina's position. As he ascended through the secondary route, Noah could see through the water that the area around Collection Point 7 had become crowded. In addition to the Seraphina, there were now 3 other vessels on the surface, including a large boat that was clearly equipped for professional diving operations. Noah surfaced quietly near a cluster of rocks about 200 yards from the main activity, using the natural formations to conceal his position while he assessed the situation. Jake was following protocols perfectly, maintaining radio silence and keeping the Seraphina positioned for quick departure. But Noah could see that their boat was now surrounded. The waterproof storage container he'd recovered was small enough to handle easily, but heavy enough to suggest it contained substantial documentation. According to Marcus's coding system, this container held policy documentation classified, indefinitely open, only under extreme circumstances. Noah decided that the current circumstances qualified as extreme. Inside the container, wrapped in multiple layers of waterproof protection, was a collection of documents that made his blood run cold. Official correspondence between government agencies, agreements between allied nations about the handling of recovered cultural materials, and most damning, evidence that many of the materials Marcus had been protecting had been officially written off as lost to enemy action, while actually being preserved in private custody. The implications were staggering. Marcus hadn't just been a rogue operative protecting cultural treasures, he'd been part of an officially sanctioned program that had been kept secret for 70 years. And now people were trying to recover these materials, not to return them to their rightful owners, but to ensure that the evidence of the program's existence never became public. Noah's secure radio crackled with Jake's voice. "Dad, I don't know where you are, but you need to know that one of the boats here is flying federal flags. I think we've got official government involvement now. Looking across the water at the vessels surrounding Collection Point 7, Noah realized that their treasure hunt had evolved into something far more serious. They were no longer racing against private treasure hunters. They were caught in the middle of a government operation to recover evidence of activities that powerful people needed to keep classified. And somewhere in the middle of that operation, Noah's 12-year-old son was trying to maintain their position and wait for his father to return from a dive that had just revealed secrets that could threaten national security. Noah swam underwater toward the Serafina, using the hull of one of the larger vessels as cover. The documents he'd recovered were secured in his dive bag, but the weight of what they revealed was heavier than any physical burden he'd ever carried. As he approached his boat, Noah could hear voices across the water, official tones, radio chatter, the kind of coordinated communication that indicated a federal operation in progress. Jake was handling the situation with remarkable composure, responding to official questions with the careful answers they'd rehearsed. "This is the sailing vessel Serafina." Jake's voice carried clearly across the water. "My father is conducting legitimate diving operations on our family property. We have all required permits and documentation." Family property. Noah smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Jake was technically correct. Marcus had left them the coordinates and legal access to the storage sites. The boy was learning to use precision of language, the way Marcus had used it for 70 years. Noah surfaced silently at the Serafina's stern, using the swim platform to pull himself aboard without creating obvious disturbance. Jake saw him immediately and moved to provide concealment while Noah got out of his diving gear. "Status report," Noah whispered. "3 vessels total," Jake reported quietly. "The Coast Guard cutter we met yesterday, one boat that looks private but is flying federal flags, and Catherine Wells's sport fisher. Commander Martinez is trying to maintain control of the situation, but the federal people are claiming jurisdiction." Noah looked at the documents he'd recovered, then at his son's worried face. The contents of Marcus's most sensitive storage container would answer questions that multiple government agencies had been asking for decades. But releasing those documents would also reveal a 70-year conspiracy that could embarrass allies and expose operations that had been officially denied. "Jake, I need you to make a decision. We can surface with these documents and turn them over to the federal agents, which means trusting that they'll handle them responsibly. Or we can try to get away from here and find someplace safe to review what we've found before deciding what to do with it." Jake looked at the boats surrounding them, then at his father's serious expression. "What would Uncle Marcus have wanted us to do?" "I think Uncle Marcus would have wanted us to understand what we're protecting before we decide who to trust with it." "Then we get out of here," Jake said decisively. "But how? We're surrounded by government boats." Noah looked at the positions of the other vessels and realized that Jake was right. They were effectively trapped. Any attempt to leave would be noticed immediately and would probably result in official intervention. But as Noah studied the situation more carefully, he noticed something the federal agents might have missed. The tide was changing, and the current patterns around Collection Point 7 were becoming more complex. During his Coast Guard years, Noah had learned to use natural conditions to his advantage, and the changing tide might provide exactly the cover they needed. "Jake, how's our fuel situation?" "Full tanks. I topped them off yesterday like you taught me." "Good. And the engine?" "Running perfectly. Sam helped me with the final adjustments while you were meeting with the federal people yesterday." Noah made his decision. "We're going to use the tide change to create confusion. When I give you the signal, start the engine and head directly toward the federal vessel, not the Coast Guard cutter, the other one. Make it look like we're going to surrender ourselves." Jake looked confused. "But we're not actually surrendering." "No. At the last second, we're going to change course and use their own position to screen us from the other boats. The tide current will help push us past them, and once we're clear, we head for the secondary location Marcus marked in his dive logs." "The backup storage site?" "Exactly. If Marcus built one sophisticated underwater installation, he probably built others." And if we can find a site that hasn't been compromised, we might be able to understand what we're really protecting. Jake studied the positions of the other boats with the tactical thinking Noah had been teaching him. Dad, that's going to be really risky. If we miscalculate the timing or the current, we could end up ramming a federal vessel. Yes, but if we stay here, we're going to lose control of materials that Marcus spent his life protecting. Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to do the right thing. Jake nodded with the kind of trust that made Noah's chest tight with emotion. His son was willing to follow his father into danger because he believed in the mission Marcus had left them. Okay, Dad, when do we go? Noah watched the tide markers he'd learned to read during his diving career. The current was shifting, creating the kind of confused water conditions that would make precise boat handling difficult for the other vessels. Now, Noah said. Jake started the Serafina's engine with smooth competence, bringing her up to cruising speed and heading directly toward the federal vessel, exactly as Noah had instructed. The response was immediate radio calls demanding their intentions, official voices ordering them to maintain position, the sound of other engines starting as the surrounding boats prepared to intercept them. But Noah had timed the maneuver for the moment, when the changing tide would create maximum confusion. As they approached the federal vessel, the current caught their bow and pushed them slightly off course, exactly as Noah had calculated. Instead of ramming the federal boat, the Serafina slipped past their stern with just yards to spare, using the larger vessel's hull to screen their movement from the other boats. By the time the federal agents realized what was happening, the Serafina was already beyond effective intercept range and accelerating toward open water. Jake, that was perfect boat handling, Noah said with pride as they cleared the immediate area. Marcus would have been impressed. Thanks, Dad. Where are we heading? Noah pulled out the charts that showed Marcus's secondary storage locations. Collection Point 14. According to the dive logs, it's a smaller installation, but Marcus visited it regularly, right up until the end. If we're going to understand what he really wanted us to protect, that's our best chance. Behind them, Noah could see the federal boats organizing pursuit, but the Serafina had a crucial advantage. Marcus had chosen his storage locations based partly on their accessibility by small boat, and the secondary sites were in waters too shallow for larger vessels to follow safely. As they headed toward Collection Point 14, Noah opened the waterproof container he'd recovered and began studying the documents that had been classified for 70 years. What he found made him understand why Marcus had been so careful about choosing his heir, and why powerful people were willing to risk exposure to recover these materials. The documents detailed not just the recovery of cultural artifacts, but the creation of an international network for protecting materials that various governments preferred to keep out of public attention. Art, historical documents, and evidence of wartime activities that could embarrass current allies or reveal operations that had never been officially acknowledged. Marcus hadn't just been a cultural preservationist, they'd been the custodian of an entire shadow archive of materials that powerful people needed to remain hidden. Jake, Noah said, I think I understand now why Uncle Marcus left this to us and why he was so careful about how he did it. What do you mean? He wasn't just protecting these materials from thieves or treasure hunters. He was protecting them from governments that wanted to control what history people were allowed to know. Jake looked back at the pursuing boats, then at his father's serious expression. So we're not just treasure hunters anymore. No, Noah agreed. We're guardians of history that some very powerful people don't want anyone to see. 6 months later, Noah stood on the deck of the Serafina as she rocked gently at her permanent mooring in the Smithsonian Institution's Maritime Heritage Center. The yacht that had once been dismissed as a floating wreck was now officially designated as a National Historic Vessel, and Noah wore the title of Curator of the Marcus Briggs Maritime Archives with quiet pride. Jake bounded up from the cabin, carrying a stack of authentication documents that had just arrived from the Louvre. At 13, he'd grown 3 inches, and gained the kind of confidence that came from discovering he could handle adult responsibilities when circumstances required it. "Dad, look at this," Jake said, spreading the documents across the chart table. "The French Cultural Ministry wants to display Uncle Marcus's recovered Monet paintings as part of their exhibit on art rescue operations during World War II. Noah studied the official correspondence with satisfaction. After months of negotiations between federal agencies, international museums, and cultural institutions, Marcus's lifetime of preservation work was finally being acknowledged publicly. The artifacts were being returned to their proper homes, the documentation was being made available to historians, and the story of one man's 70-year commitment to protecting cultural heritage was inspiring a new generation of preservationists. "What about the Van Gogh sketches?" Noah asked, checking his own list of items scheduled for repatriation. "Going to the Netherlands next month. The Dutch ambassador is personally coming to the ceremony." Jake paused, then looked up with the kind of smile that reminded Noah how much his son had grown through their adventure. "Dad, do you ever regret not keeping any of it? I mean, we could have been really rich." Noah looked around the Serafina's transformed interior. Where there had once been rotting upholstery and makeshift repairs, there were now climate-controlled display cases showing photographs and documents from Marcus's operations. The hidden compartments had been converted into educational exhibits, and the main cabin served as a research center where scholars from around the world came to study the materials Marcus had preserved. "Jake, we are really rich. Maybe not in the way your mom worried about, but in ways that matter more." Linda had been skeptical at first, when federal agents had appeared to explain that her ex-husband had inherited guardianship of one of the most significant cultural preservation operations in modern history. But when Jake had been invited to speak at the International Conference on Cultural Heritage Protection, when universities had started offering Noah consulting positions, when the family name had become associated with integrity and historical preservation rather than unemployment and boat-dwelling, her attitude had shifted to something approaching respect. "Besides," Noah continued, "Uncle Marcus was right about one thing: some treasures are only valuable if they're shared with the world." Sam Rodriguez appeared at the dock, carrying his usual cup of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a marina manager whose most problematic tenant had become his most famous success story. "Morning, Noah, Jake. Got another group of school kids scheduled for tours this afternoon." "Two groups," Jake confirmed, fourth graders from San Diego and a high school marine science class from Santa Barbara. The educational tours had been Jake's idea, a way to share the story of Marcus's work with young people who might be inspired to pursue careers in archaeology, marine science, or cultural preservation. Jake had proven to be a natural teacher, able to explain complex historical concepts in ways that made them accessible and exciting. "Any word from Commander Martinez about the final site recovery?" Sam asked. "She's finishing up at Collection Point 23 this week," Noah replied. "That should complete the systematic documentation of all Marcus's storage locations." The cooperative relationship with federal agencies had taken months to establish, but eventually they'd reached an agreement that satisfied everyone's concerns. The government agencies got access to materials with national security implications, the cultural institutions got their artifacts back, and Noah and Jake got to continue Marcus's work under official auspices rather than as amateur treasure hunters. "Dad," Jake said, looking up from a letter he'd been reading, "Mrs. Chen wants to know if we'd be interested in consulting on a similar case. Apparently there's another World War II operative whose family just discovered evidence of hidden cultural materials." Noah felt the familiar stirring of curiosity and challenge that had drawn him into Marcus's mystery in the first place. "What do you think? Are we ready for another adventure?" "Are you kidding? After everything we've learned about underwater archaeology, historical research, and cultural preservation, I think we're probably the best team in the country for this kind of work." The confidence in Jake's voice reminded Noah of how much they'd both grown over the past year. Jake had discovered skills and interests he'd never known he possessed, while Noah had found a career that combined his technical diving abilities with meaningful purpose. More importantly, They'd learned to work together as partners in a way that had strengthened their relationship beyond what either of them had imagined possible. Noah's phone buzzed with a text from Carol. "Saw the article about you in National Geographic. Mom wants to know if you're finally ready to act like a normal person again. Family dinner Sunday?" Normal person. Noah looked at Jake, who was carefully cataloguing authentication documents with the precision of a professional archivist. He looked at the Serafina, transformed from a liability into a national treasure. He looked at the visitors who came daily to learn about Marcus's work and the importance of protecting cultural heritage. "Jake, do you think we're normal people now?" Jake considered the question seriously. "Well, we live on a museum boat. We dive for historical artifacts. We work with federal agents and international art recovery specialists. And we're probably going to spend the summer investigating another 70-year-old mystery. So that's a no?" "That's a definitely not. But Dad, I don't think Uncle Marcus was normal either. And look how much good he did in the world." Noah had to agree. Marcus Briggs had spent his life protecting things that others considered expendable, preserving pieces of human culture that might otherwise have been lost forever. He'd operated outside normal channels, made decisions based on long-term thinking rather than immediate convenience, and ultimately trusted his life's work to a nephew who'd seemed to be failing at everything. But Marcus had seen something in Noah that Noah hadn't seen in himself, the capacity to grow into responsibility, to understand that some things were worth protecting regardless of personal cost, and to raise a son who would share those values. "You know what the best part is?" Jake asked, organizing the last of the authentication documents into their proper files. "What's that?" "We get to keep doing this. Uncle Marcus's work is finished, but there are other people who need help protecting important things. Other families who've inherited mysteries they don't understand. Other pieces of history that need to be preserved." Noah looked at his son's eager expression and realized that Marcus's greatest treasure hadn't been the art or artifacts he'd preserved. It had been the values he'd passed, on the understanding that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they committed themselves to protecting what mattered. "Okay," Noah said, pulling out his phone to call Mrs. Chen about the new case she'd mentioned. "Let's see what our next adventure looks like." As the sun set over the marina, casting golden light across the Serafina's restored deck, Noah felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered. He and Jake had inherited more than just a treasure hunt. They'd inherited a purpose that would last the rest of their lives. And somewhere, Noah liked to think, Uncle Marcus was watching with approval as his carefully chosen heirs continued the work he'd started 70 years ago, proving that the most valuable treasures were the ones you shared with the world. The family dinner with Carol and his mother could wait. There were mysteries to solve, cultures to preserve, and adventures to share with a son who'd learned that being normal was considerably less interesting than being extraordinary. The Serafina rocked gently at her mooring as Jake secured the last of the day's paperwork, and Noah plotted coordinates for their next expedition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities to prove that Marcus Briggs had chosen his heirs wisely. But tonight, father and son sat on the deck of their floating museum, surrounded by the evidence of one man's lifetime commitment to protecting what mattered, and planned their next steps in continuing work that would never truly be finished. Some legacies, Noah had learned, were meant to be passed on rather than concluded, and some treasures were only valuable when they inspired others to discover treasures of their own.